have the belief from a pretty long career of observation and reflection that there is a definite reason behind the life of every human being. There is a particular purpose. Nature does not produce non-essentials. Nature has not fashioned some persons to succeed and others to fail. Nature has never been extravagant with life. Every living thing fulfills part of a plan. And this plan in the human being has been individualized. Each person is here for a purpose. Now, why are so many not aware of this purpose? I think the answer lies in the fact that the average person is confused by pressures that are artificial. He comes into this life perhaps in the highest degree of his intelligence. As a newborn babe, he is probably wiser than he will ever be again in this life. That perhaps is one of the reasons why so many come weeping into the world. But we also realize that many children have strange and mysterious depths even in infancy. Their little faces seem to bear witness to something more than the obvious. The moment, however, the child is born, it is regarded as a kind of lump of putty. Everybody wants to get their fingers in it. Everyone wants to help this child succeed. And before they get through, they may definitely force the child to become a failure. In an effort to assume that this material world in which we live for a few years is the most important place in the universe, and that to achieve some minor success here is the outstanding distinction to which a human being can attain. The process of fitting the personality into the traditional patterns closes in around the small child. He is told what to believe and how to believe. If he is in a religious family, he is told who to worship and what church is proper for him. And as he goes into school, he comes into contact with a mass of conditioned associates. Children like himself, who have been more or less destroyed before they even reach grammar school. Destroyed in the sense that the internal pressure of a reality behind themselves is being continuously blocked. After a time, this growing person begins to assume that adjustment with the world in which he lives, adjustment in the sense of acceptance, is of the primary importance. He is exposed to all kinds of conditionings. Among others, he is taught that he must gradually accumulate an education that will enable him to make a living. He is impressed with the psychosis of success. If he is lacking in aggressive ambitions, these are stimulated if possible. And if they cannot be stimulated, it is assumed he will end up as a second-class citizen. The individual never really is encouraged to make use of his own resources. Yet behind this pressure constantly exerted upon him, there is something else, and that may be described perhaps as the will of life, the eternal reality, which is far deeper and more important than all of the various superficial levels and structures that are built upon it. The only way we can really approach this is to realize that when we have received the full conditioning of our society and have attained physical maturity, that perhaps we will be able to pause for a moment and try to find out a little more about ourselves. Usually, however, this moment of pause only comes when physical or emotional reverses break down the structure of the so-called physical, material, industrial plan for living. Nearly always a crisis, a great disappointment, a heartache, a desperate illness. These are the kinds of pressures that perhaps have been placed here to remind us that we have an individual existence, and that this existence must be given expression, or the life we are living will remain incomplete. There are very few of us who manage to get through this world without some kind of sorrow, without reverses, disillusionments, and even despairs. And these bear witness, in most cases, to the fact that we are not fulfilling the purpose for which we were created. The materialist doesn't believe there is a purpose, and therefore he is constantly contributing to a purposeless existence. His only out in this is material advancement. The individual becomes the banker, then perhaps another individual becomes the university professor, and in these achievements comes to regard his life as fulfilled. Yet in reality, he has gone through 50, 60, 70 years of physical existence and learned virtually nothing. He has not even learned to direct his energies toward the fulfillment of a universal procedure very much bigger than any material ambition can possibly be. Where are we going to equate this? How are we going to approach it? Well, perhaps one way is to study ourselves at any age, whenever the impulse first arises within us. In the midst of all the things we are doing because they appear reasonable or inevitable, sometime we can ask ourselves, what would I really want to do? If conditions permitted to me to make a completely free choice, in what direction would my natural instincts impel me? It may well be that I'm a successful lawyer, but I always wanted to be a sea captain. Another individual always wanted to be a poet, but was never able to get around to doing much more than signing checks. What would the person be if he was able to fulfill the deepest parts of his own life? What would the small, quiet voice inside of him recommend if the pressure of outside over-influence was not there? I think that every living thing from the mineral kingdom on has some kind of an intuitional inner life. And this intuitional inner life impels that living thing, whatever it is, to fulfill the purpose for which it was created. To assume that the universal destiny is fulfilled by a person becoming a political leader or a major economist or an advisor to something, such cannot possibly be regarded as important to nature. Nature, which is a leveler of all things, nature which moves behind all the processes that we recognize, certainly is not too much concerned as to whether we have a swimming pool or not. Nature has a job of its own, and nature is working through living things to fulfill a common good. And each of us is in some way an instrument in this plan. And it is very important for us to try to understand the natural purpose for humanity. Why was the human being created? Why was the breath of life breathed into him? Why was he given a body such as he has? What was nature's purpose in placing him in an environmental world such as he knows? These questions are overlooked and ignored because they run contrary to our approved policies for conduct. Yet we cannot assume that nature was frustrated by the fall of the Roman Empire, or that the divine plan was overthrown by Adolf Hitler, or Alexander the Great, or Genghis Khan. These are episodes, incidents on the outer surface of human existence. They bear witness to ignorance, and false ambitions, arrogance, tyranny, which are not naturally given to us by deity. The idea that we are a compound of good and bad, with for the most part weakness predominating, is not solid when we contemplate it in terms of nature. Nature has put us together in an extraordinary way. It has created a being that even the greatest scientists cannot yet even estimate. Man is full of wonders. Nature has conspired to produce a miracle and called it humanity. And now the question is, what is this miracle going to produce? What is going to justify the millions of years of physical evolution that lies behind man? What is going to justify the constant unfoldment of faculties and powers? Most of them have been perverted. They have been degraded into instruments of profit. But behind the individual is a creativity that is superior to the uses that have been made of the creative instinct. Back of the individual is a resource infinitely greater than anything he ever uses. Why doesn't he use it? Well, to the most people, there is not even the realization that it exists. They've lived on the surface of themselves from the beginning and expect to end there. And having had this magnificent fabric bestowed upon them, they depart from this world with very little that they have contributed to the advancement of anything. How then does man get this incredible potential? The answer seems to be only one possible solution, and that is reincarnation. The individual is not here for the first or last time. He is here as part of a chain of embodiments. And the purpose of this chain of embodiments is the enrichment of the inner life of the individual. He has grown up through thousands of years, millions of years perhaps, of adjustment or neo-adjustment with environment. He has gradually come nearer and nearer to becoming able to use rather than abuse the circumstances that exist around him. Now, in this long procedure of rebirths, the individual has gradually matured a personal entity, an individuality. This individuality is based upon the accumulated wisdom, the accumulated experience, and to a large measure also, the accumulated wisdom which has come to him. This accumulation has resulted in a great generalization of abilities which we overlook. It does not follow that an individual like Stradivarius was a violin maker since the dawn of time, because back a little ways there were not any violins. But he was developing talents, abilities, which gradually came together to provide him with a kind of genius. And this genius to the Greeks was not a quality but a being, the genius in us. This genius is a composite subconscious, subjective record of the totality of our experience. It does not necessarily represent a continuity, because in many instances the life of the individual is violently changed. But it is always a record of a relationship between the individual and his environment. It began perhaps in the Stone Age or earlier, but it was always a struggle on the part of the individual to attain security in a hazardous environment. We are still struggling for the same thing. But unfortunately, we are not making use of the accumulated resource of previous experience. Because it is not consciously remembered, it is ignored. And we have no way of explaining the various intuitions, hunches, feelings, pressures that do arise within ourselves. These pressures divide naturally into a number of levels. On one level, these pressures are simply the perpetuation of mistakes, which continue to pound us and annoy us until they are corrected. Another level of these pressures is imagination, intuition, the individual becoming inwardly aware of values greater than the commonplace. Most of our great teachers in philosophy and religion, the great idealists, the great sociologists, the utopians, all these people are born with a strong summation within themselves of what they have gone through in the past, why it was not sufficient, and how in the present embodiment they can make use of that which has gone before. Physically, we can say we build upon history, but there is another kind of history. Records within ourselves, records within the flesh, the bone, the nerve, the artery, the glands, pressures within ourselves that bear witness to ages of conditioning. Now, it is not at all seemly that all this record, this internal achievement pattern, should be completely wasted. The fact that we do not consciously remember it is largely due to the fact that we have been taught not to consciously remember it by our environment. Some small child who precociously exhibits genius is a cause of joy to some and a cause of problems to others. We know that such things happen. We know there are people born in this world to play the piano. We know there are people who are born to paint or to write good poetry. We know there's some here that are born for sciences and philosophies, and others are, by pressure within themselves, inevitably drawn to religion. These attractions do not arise from the superficial relationships of life. We know definitely that a great variety of so-called talents come into life with us. We tried to solve all this with the law of heredity, and it did not work. We find that there is no physical heredity consistent enough to explain the peculiar genius of individuals. Many very famous and important creators have come from environments in which there was no background in any way comparable to what was attained. And again, these very geniuses very often do not transmit their skills or their abilities to progeny. And very often the children of genius are mediocre. There is something else that determines these things, and that something is the record the individual carries within himself. He doesn't have the details, but he does have a balance sheet which he brings with him, in which the assets and liabilities, the credits and debits, produce a peculiar type of internal integration. An integration which is going to dominate life if this is permitted. Now, this record of integration is not primarily built around material success. If we go back, assuming that the individual was born many times on this earth, go back a few hundred or a few thousand years, and practically all of the activities with which we are familiar today were in a very incipient state. There were no great economists, because we were not even concerned with an economic system primarily. There were very few great leaders in any field, and very few skills were developed that correspond to our computerization today or to the advancements we now know in the sciences. It was an entirely different type of progress. It was a progress intended to release the conscious power of the person, to help the individual to grow. For growth is nothing more or less than the unfoldment and revelation of potential. Growth is, in truth, the individual becoming slowly but inevitably that which he was destined to be in the beginning. And to fulfill this destiny, the individual has to move his levels of estimation, realizing that the institutions we have today will pass away, as did those which went before. The laws, the national integrations, the entities with which we are now familiar are part of a passing pageantry. The world will change, for nothing is changeless but change. And much of the experience that we gain today in various arts and sciences will be of comparatively little use in a different type of social integration. But the experiences of growing, the experiences of gradually unfolding inner verities through transient physical manifestations, these experiences continue to accumulate. So we must finally, it seems, come to the original idea of nature, natural law and divine law, that the human being was created in the first place to amount to something, and that something is not to be judged in terms of the physical, mechanical, materialistic objectives to which we are addicted today. What we are really here for is part of the whole growth program of the universe itself. And every step that we take is, for instance, related to certain values within ourselves. One of these values is integrity. Now, integrity is something that naturally would express itself in the lives of most people. But integrity is gradually undermined by compromise. The individual, trying to avoid an unpleasant experience, departs from honesty. Or in order to advance his material estate, he corrupts his own morality. Or through weakness of appetites, he again compromises his personal virtues. Therefore, we have forever a struggle between integrity and compromise. Now, this struggle can go on anywhere. It can go on in a cave. It can go on in an ancient classical culture. It can go on today, and does go on, in the highly economized, mechanized civilization we know. It still remains inevitably part of human character to do it well or to compromise. But compromise is more pressureful where the advantages of compromise appear to be more desirable. But the entire story of man's morality and ethics goes back to the problem of compromise. It looks as though nature intends that we shall develop the internal strength of integrity. Integrity is a valuable thing. It is not only valuable here, but no matter what happens to our culture, it remains valuable. And what happens to us after we depart from here, integrity is one of the most important and required factors of evolution and progress. So all through thousands of years, we may have been trying to find integrity. Some people started looking for it at a very early age in the history of society. Others even begin to struggle for it only in the middle years of the present embodiment. But always nature demands it. nature must gradually prove to us that integrity alone fulfills natural requirement. Here we have a world that could be a rather beautiful place with many opportunities. Most of the good has been compromised through lack of integrity. Life after life, the private citizen has suffered from the dishonesty of his associates and has compromised his life by his own dishonesty. On and on this goes, and will go probably for quite a time. But each person is able to break that pattern when he realizes that it is important to do so. And the fact that conscience remains, even though it seems to be very badly undermined, reminds us strongly that the desire for integrity is innate, and the desire for compromise is impermanent and due to external pressure. Another factor that is important in the pattern of things is the emotional pressure of life. Actually, the divine plan calls for a beautiful world. It calls for a world in which people are happy, useful, and able to achieve emotional fulfillment through the proper expression of affection, friendship, cooperation, and integrities. But most people do not achieve this. They have moved the entire emotional world down into the gratification of physical appetites of one kind or another, only to discover in the end that these appetites cannot be satisfied, and that no matter what we do or how we try to achieve happiness from the outside and through the fulfillment of appetites, we remain miserable. This record is so long and so well established that it's a wonder that it has not received scientific recognition. But the fact is that the individual who tries to be happy is miserable, but the individual who tries to be right comes nearer to happiness than any other mortal can come. We have many such basic characteristics. One of these, which I think is very basic, is friendship. Most people are by instinct friendly, but by experience they have become cautious and disillusioned. Friendship is no longer a simple acceptance of the inevitable relationships of life. Actually, friendship is the basis of all cooperation in nature. Friendship is the emotion that could end war, end poverty, break down the barriers of isolation, and correct most of the neurotic pressures of the individual. But by false conditioning, the natural desire toward friendliness has been blocked. The individual has been exploited, therefore he will not give his friendship without reservation. Yet within him he wants it. Now if each of us, or even one of us, wants the basic experience of friendship, it is also true that every human being has this same basic emotion, for these pressures come with life energy itself. The energy which supports the human being is not merely a physical energy, it is a moral energy. It not only rejoices in accuracy, it rejoices in beauty. And it has discovered that accuracy and beauty are the same thing. That every relation that is constructive and normal is beautiful. And every relationship that is not beautiful or has been perverted is abnormal. But the individual does not really understand how to face into this, how to work toward the revelation of the integrities in himself. There where we come into the various disciplines that have been adapted from time immemorial, in an effort to help the person to rediscover himself, or reaffirm his own actual place in the universal plan of infinite benevolence most of the disciplines that have been accepted in recent centuries and also in ancient times were disciplines of which the individual was expected to perform certain disciplined actions toward himself. It was assumed that he must quiet and subdue the authority of outside circumstances over his own inner life. He must break through the barriers of slavery. Serfdom is an artificial state, for in the infinite plan of things, all living creatures have equal rights. Each individual has an equal right with all others. And serfdom is nearly always the result of a mistaken interpretation of personal freedom. The moment that the individual becomes a slave to his own negative attitudes, he is in slavery. So the Greeks and the Orientals and the Egyptians and the early Christians all worked upon the problem of the individual achieving freedom. And it was generally agreed that freedom depended upon the person emancipating his own consciousness from the miasma of material addictions. The individual can live in this world, but not be of it. He can fulfill every duty of citizenship and family without becoming deluded by the false values that have sprung up in the human environment. So in discipline, the ancients believed that appetites and ambitions must be disciplined and curtailed. The individual must gradually divide himself from the common environment and assume or reveal his own personal destiny. Now, a personal destiny does not mean a rugged individualism. It does not mean that the individual is no longer benevolently inclined. His real problem is to discover himself as a factor in the infinite good of all that lives. He has to realize that there are many jobs to be done in connection with the release of consciousness through the personality. Each individual has a place in the labor of growth. He is involved in the unfoldment of all other human beings. This is because we accept that the plan for things was correct, that the divine purpose is real, and that there is no possible way of changing the basic requirements of living. We can change our false interpretations of them with every passing day, but the truth remains that we are here to grow and to serve. And it is important and inevitable that this gradually comes to our attention. So through discipline, we gradually break away from a whole group of temptations. We begin to recognize the true relationship between the life within us, which is eternal, and the life around us, which is temporal and impermanent. And we have to reassert ourselves as citizens of eternity. We have to recognize the unbroken chain of circumstances which brought us to where we are, and how this unbroken chain will continue in the future until it brings us where we should be. And this there is no way of avoiding. So instead of trying to avoid it, it is far better to move with it. It is a means by which we capitalize the basic assets which we have and begin to give emphasis more and more upon the unfoldment of potential. Now, when we start to try to do this, we have a problem on our hands also. Namely, which way do we turn to find adequate instruction? How are we going to be sure, or reasonably sure, that any move that we make is actually in conformity with natural law. Some feel that natural law would be consummated by a completely industrialized culture. Some feel that if we reach the point finally where the world is run by robots, the human being will be free to do as he pleases. But a world run by robots will never give the individual anything to accomplish as a means of unfolding his own potential. It is a mistake for us to invent things to think for us, or to invent ways of avoiding the common learning of life. Well, there is much more to be learned by the individual who can make a good pair of shoes than can be learned by the individual who simply buys pairs of shoes. Everything that we do increases skills, increases and releases self-creative expression. Whereas when we turn completely to an economic purveyance of things, we lose practically all initiative. We lose the ability to meet problems. And as we are now at the moment, we live in a world of gadgets which we cannot even take care of. We have lost the skills to do the things which might have made the possessions that we have important means of helping us to grow. Today they are merely important means of hastening us into bankruptcy, because we do not use individual initiatives. To gain a better idea of this, it is nearly always advisable for the person to try to separate his own life. Separate his external existence from his internal existence, and recognize that the internal existence is the most important. It is the final victory of life over illusion. If he really, sincerely, and intensely knows that as a being he must grow, and that only that which becomes part of an unfolding consciousness is essential, that which merely exploits consciousness for utility is not essential. The older peoples, therefore, advised a kind of quiet restatement of our own intentions, of our own beliefs, our own patterns. What is the best that we know when we are quiet and do not depend upon the conditioning influence of those around us? What do we believe about things? What do we feel about them? Do we really want to live better than we do? If we really want to, it means that the changeover is very close, that the past has brought us to the point where we can make a positive decision. If we really don't care and have no particular incentives, then we have to go on with further conditioning, and nature will give it to us. If we don't know how to take care of our lives, we will lose them many times. But the life within them will ultimately learn how to live. And when this happens, the entire polarity of life is reversed. In the same way, most people have within them some creative expression. And one of the easiest ways to get at the average person's experience background in himself is through some form of creative self-expression. I know many people who have wanted to express themselves, but they have either lacked the courage or have not felt they could devote the time, or else regard the investment as unprofitable. But somewhere along the line, creativity must break through. It broke through Grandma Moses when she was 100 years old, but it came. Now, there's no real reason why it has to be achieved only by centenarians. It can be achieved at the moment that a creative impulse takes precedence over some form of an economic pressure. If the individual wants to express, he opens the door between himself as a person and the source of himself as an eternal entity. So the problem of bringing out some creative, constructive manifestation is a means of producing what we might almost call maturity in the life of the individual. The person who realizes that they wish to become a nurse is becoming a servant of something. Now, sometimes the leaning to become a nurse is impelled only by good wages. This is not the answer. If the economic purpose is dominant, the individual is not creative. But if the economic problem is secondary, and the desire to serve is primary and honest, there is internal release. The same is true in every profession. There are many professions in which the great good can be done, but much of it is embarrassed and frustrated by the economic factor. The individual who becomes a doctor to help the sick is releasing inner life. The individual who becomes a doctor to get rich is not. He is again in slavery to the temporary environment in which he lives. Actually, this environment is such that it's a wonder that human beings have been deceived by it so long. The man who has accumulated the great fortune in the practice of a profession comes in the end, as all do, to giving it up. He cannot take it with him. It has no permanent value. And in many instances he shudders at the thought of leaving it to his descendants. So what does he do? He leaves it to an institution, simply because he has no way of taking it with him and doesn't know what to do with it. And a person who devotes his life to the creation of this dilemma has overlooked something. He has overlooked the fact that all material existence has its place. The workman is worthy of his hire. But he is not here simply to accumulate wealth at the expense of his neighbors. He is here to serve. The motto of the Prince of Wales, Ich dien, I serve, were the same words that were spoken in Wagner's opera of Parsifal when Kunri, falling at the foot of the Grail to die, says, I serve. Service is one of the great answers. And service comes in that same ray that goes into our souls to make us real. So service is the motive. If he only serves from some secondary motive, giving a day to some hospital or something of that kind because it's done, this is not the answer. The instinct to serve is a spiritual truth within man. And it comes out in the most unusual ways. There are many cases where a perfect stranger has given his life to save another one who is in great danger. No unknown reason. He didn't have to do it. But at the moment of a great catastrophe for another, his own inner life took over. And he was able to make this important sacrifice. A sacrifice which was perhaps the best thing he ever did. But it is to get at this level inside of ourselves that we must all labor to the very best of our ability. Another aspect of the same problem is the effort of the individual to resolve certain uncertainties in his own heart and mind. Most persons, unconditioned by ulterior or non-factual pressures, believes in deity. Even those who may consciously and intellectually deny it because of the sophistication of their environment, still in their heart and soul believe. They believe there is a divine providence. They believe that there is a deity at the source of life. And for most who believe this, there is also a belief that this deity is operating through humanity on the level of human beings, and that the power of this deity is centered in the heart of every creature that has the physical structure to have this occur. And in other forms of life, this deity is present very often in the magnetic field because there is not enough organization for it to enter in and dominate. But everything in the world is dominated by this divine being. It is the power of life in us Without it, we cannot breathe, and without using it, we cannot live correctly. It is this problem of getting at what life wants of us, instead of the eternal cry of what do we want from life. Our wants are limitless, but the wants of life itself are few. And the most important want or desire of life is to express its own purpose. And its own purpose is the highest purpose that any human being can conceive of. So we have the right to gradually work towards the recognition of a purposeful background for ourselves. We are here to prove that we are growing. We are not here to make all the mistakes we made over a period of 100,000 years. We are not here because we died on the battlefield of Troy. We are not here because we fought the great war of the Mahabharata. We are here because it is assumed that from previous lives we have learned something, and therefore are capable of living above the level of previous existences. Yet in our general appearance as we go along through, it does not seem that humanity has learned this. It does not seem that we are really aware that it is not foreordained and predestined that we make the same mistakes we always made. In a sense, to make a mistake is a rare individual privilege that we can't afford. But actually, we keep on making the mistakes. And why? Well, look into ourselves. I know a great many people who are quite nominally religious. They believe in religion. They believe in God. They worship their various saints and sages with real devotion. But when temptation comes along, they fall. The one told me once that God would have to overlook a few of these idiosyncrasies. It might be that if God sat on a throne in the heavens, he wouldn't notice some of them. But unfortunately, God is inside of us. It is a divine principle that knows everything about us, while we know nothing about it. So there is no avoiding. The damage is done to the psychic integration. The damage is done to the development of internal character. The compromises that we make are scar tissue in our soul fabric. There is no possible way of avoiding it. So it is up to the person not only to be a nominal believer in something, or to accept the idea that he should do better than he does. The great problem is that he must do better than he does, or else he will remain as he is. If he remains as he is, he will be worried to death over every political crisis that arises in international affairs. If he remains as he is, he will worry about high taxes, and he will worry about inflation and depression. If he continues as he is, he will have great anxieties about nuclear fission. He will recognize only the deficiencies in our various energy resources. He will live in an emergency until the emergency closes over him and actually destroys his body by exhaustion. If he continues as he is, he will continue to have exactly the same anxieties. Yet, if you look around a little, and I've done a little looking, you will find there are a great many people today who do not have these anxieties. Now, there are two kinds of people involved. One is the childlike person who has not yet accepted the reality of the illusion. And the other is the very wise person who has outgrown the era of illusion. These two, one through innocence and the other through virtue, have attained liberation. The small child doesn't know enough to worry. The older, wiser person has recognized the operation of a universal principle, has accepted it, and is trying to live in harmony with it. fully aware that nothing that is real can ever be destroyed, and that nothing that is unreal can ever be preserved. In the ecology around us in life, we perceive definitely how human abuse is gradually exhausting natural resource. We know that as long as the abuse continues, the resource will become more scarce. But this is actually part of the growing process. To discover these things, to accept them, to know they are true, and to live according to them is what we are here to accomplish. And the more that we accomplish in this way, the more we adjust to a larger vision of life. In a comparatively short time, we will depart from this uncertainty, and for a time at least, be no longer directly associated with the causes of our anxieties. But if we haven't solved them, we will be born again as people with anxieties. We might live in a completely utopian sphere at that time and be just as miserable as we are now. The individual who is miserable today will remain miserable until he solves the mystery of misery within himself, until he is able to build an acceptance of the plan of things and cooperate with it. If in the course of this life we do accomplish something that is really good, it may manifest a little bit right here now. And people who have at the moment very little incentive will find new objectives and new reasons for existence. We'll find that life is something more than trying to endure the passing of years with the full realization they're going to end one of these days. This is not life. This is not purpose. The individual who wastes time so it'll pass more quickly doesn't realize it, but he lives in a universe in which there is enough time for him to continue to make this mistake as long as he wishes to. But he will not win. In the long run, nature achieves. Because nature has put into every cell the secret of its own salvation. It has put into the individual every faculty and power necessary for him to achieve liberation from the delusions and illusions of an unreasonable life. He is here essentially surrounded by a series of social disciplines also. And if he is unable to learn directly from his own inner core, he is perhaps able to learn through the experience of his own conduct. This is one way in which we understand nature. We know what nature wants largely by discovering what it does not want and learning from experience. But experience is always with us in the physical world. We are surrounded by problem after problem, and there are many clinical answers to many of these problems. If you go to a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist with a heap of worries, he will probably very quickly remark or bring to light the fact that you are suffering from a wrong mental attitude. And if later this wrong mental attitude begins to interfere with the function of the body itself, your physician, realizing that your mind is wrecking your body, will send you back to some psychologist and tell him to clear it up. The individual, however, with all this complex and quite a little expense thrown in as a special inducement, because there's nothing at the present time apparently that comes closer to sincerity than the loss of money. The individual could learn very simply. He looks at himself and he finds out that he's been nursing all kinds of destructive attitudes until finally he is sick. And if he nurses them long enough, he will be sick. And if he does nothing about it after he gets sick, he will probably die. And he will die of his own attitudes, which have been allowed to become chronic. Now, he could have learned something from this. A few do. Many do not. Others feel that when they have this kind of a problem come on, the answer is to medicate for it, to take all kinds of sedations and tranquilizers and things of this kind, in order to control a disposition that needs to be disciplined from within the individual himself. The only way in which you can get over a dispositional peculiarity is to change yourself. Because if you die with that psychotic situation, you will be where you can't get the pills, but the ailment will linger on. You're not going to get rid of it. So in the end, you have to live with yourself. And nature says, let's make it compatible. Let's live in a way in which you can be comparatively happy, comfortable, and well-adjusted. All this means that we have to gradually take hold of our own lives. We have to do something to break through, not a complacency, but a sense of helplessness, or the simple sense of not recognizing the problems at all, just not knowing they exist, but knowing very clearly the troubles that they cause do exist. Actually, to gain gradually a certain insight can be a very inspiring and wonderful experience. If we suddenly realize that there isn't anyone who hasn't got a job in nature, that everyone here is capable of useful cooperation with the plan of life, and that we all have the right and privilege to grow, and are here for that purpose, we can build our lives more and more around the concept of growth instead of the concept of futility. No individual needs to sit around doing nothing. If he is doing nothing, this is not leisure. This is just simply a strange loneliness in a universe that is made up entirely of life. The person who has no interest in life is dead while yet he lives. But those who have great interest in life, though they die, live forever. It is a matter of bringing out a simple fact that we are creatures of law, that we are fashioned according to a plan, that this plan exists forever as an archetype in the divine mind, that we are the products of a purposeful pattern, and that the deity that fashioned us has appointed us to be the agents of that deity in the perfection of an order of living things. Now, there may be many orders of living things in space, but our order we likely call humanity. And humanity is not merely 4.5 billion people. Humanity is one entity. Humanity is an order of life. And it is part of the plan of things that humanity shall become perfected. That everything that was implanted in humanity as a potential, as a beneficial power given by deity, shall be brought forth to fruition. That it shall bear fruit according to its kind. And that from this gradual cooperation, this gradual mingling of purposes and motives on a constructive level, humanity as an entity, as a simple being, collective, will come into its inheritance. That it will fulfill the purpose for itself. When this occurs, then the entities that are here will have cooperated and will have graduated from this particular grade in the school of creation. Humanity may be in the first year of high school, or it may be the post-kindergarten. But whichever it is, we graduate when we outgrow that particular type of condition. And we outgrow it only by mastering it. We can never outgrow it by voting it out or trying to evade it. No government can take care of people who cannot take care of themselves. They have to gradually be taught to use the resources with which they have been endowed. Now, in our way of life, there's also a great misunderstanding as to what constitutes a good life. To many people, a good life is an opulent life. It is a life of leisure. It is a life of extravagance. It is a life of being able to do exactly what you please, whether what you please is good or not. Therefore, all of the ambitions of the race are directed towards a superior social state. This in itself, of course, is related to karma. But who is to judge the karma? Perhaps this so-called exalted state is more or less an examination, a test. We have at some time or other earned a greater degree of security than some others have earned. So it's given to us. And having been given to us, we promptly abuse it. Therefore we lose it again. You can never abuse anything into a permanent possession. Consequently, it is a kind of testing. Perhaps we have, through virtuous action, gained the right to certain benefits. In other words, good karma moves in on reincarnation. And the person who has done a good deed is the recipient of a good deed. And if we have achieved a certain management over lesser things, we will be given power over greater things. So it comes. And the moment we get the power over greater things, we proceed to forget our principles and abuse that power. Then, as Buddha says, who came and walked as a king will come back as a beggar. For things done and things undone. Therefore, there is no security in physical estate, nor is there any deficiency in the lack of it. It is very possible that the greatest growth will be done by people who will never even be aware of that growth as far as this life is concerned. They will be people you will never hear of, but people who conscientiously and with dedication try to fulfill the proper and reasonable responsibilities of life. By so doing, they contribute to the release of their own inner soul power. And as Gandhi once said, the great victory is the victory of soul power over brute force. Wherever we are self-centered and selfish, we belong to a level of brute function. But when we transform or transmute all the energies that we have into soul power, then we begin to live not for ourselves but for the good of others. Gradually, by degrees, we recognize opportunities to serve. We become involved in patterns and circumstances that are a permanent good to others. And as in the case of most of the great teachers of the world, we become martyrs to the needs of others. All of these are part of a good preparation for the future. We are going to grow. We are going to fulfill the proper destiny which was assigned to us. As we grow in this way, we will find that a great archetypal pattern, Bhumi speaks about these patterns. There is an archetypal pattern of humanity. It is a magnificent radiant star, a magnificent living light. And what the human being is attempting to do with all others of his kind is to fulfill this archetype, to bring it into perfect incarnation in the structure of humanity itself. It is this pattern of the perfect humanity that the divine mind projected at the very beginning. We are here to be ye perfect. And to be perfect, the individual has to perfect his own nature. The problem of perfecting is, however, not, according to nature itself, difficult. And most persons in what they might consider a better environment would do much better than they do now. But the great victory is the victory of self over circumstance. This is the sign of strength. In the ancient mysteries, the neophytes for initiation, the candidates, were tested even to the degree of physical danger. They occasionally were killed in the initiation rites because of the severity of them. Now, these rites no longer exist in the world. Many people are glad they do not. But others have also noticed with some thoughtfulness that these testings now go on the level of society. A lot of us lose our lives in attempting to achieve victory over the lower self. Everywhere there is testing, everywhere there is crisis, and only those who gradually perfect their own natures come finally to become custodians of the larger truths, to become aware in substance and certainty that which the rest of us must dream about and hope for. But the testing of the individual is inevitable. Therefore, in this time, we are really very fortunate people. We don't really think so much of that at the present time, but actually a crisis such as we are in is definitely an initiation. It is a test, and each individual is going to react according to what he is. And each individual should note carefully his natural reaction. He should note whether or not this situation is bringing out something of his own higher understanding, or whether it is merely making him irritable and frightened. If he has no resource within himself to face change, then he should begin to search inside of himself very assiduously. He must find the victory of his own inner insight over the pressure of society. If enough people do this, of course, the social problem would be solved. But in time, enough individuals will gradually assemble so that the problems will instinctively fade away. But this will not probably be in one life or even a dozen lives. But ultimately, the changes in human reaction will result in the transformation of social structures. Society will emerge as a composite structure of a proper nature and purpose, as more and more individuals live for what they give and not for what they get. The Reformation, the universal Reformation, begins in man and must continue in man until the work is finished. So we say again, try occasionally to imagine, to visualize more or less what you would have done with your life if you could have lived it exactly according to your perhaps childhood hopes, the dreams that you had in the beginning, which were merely perhaps dramatized fairy tales. But actually the fairy tale is an archetypal dream, and in the long run we are all going to live together forever in happiness. But it's a long way off for the majority. But in this fairy tale life, think back to what you would have been before ambition got you, before the pressures of other people affected you, before your dreams were blighted. What did you want to be? What kind of a person did you want to be? And in your early teens, before you got set in too heavy an educational pattern, what would you have liked to do with your life? What kind of a career would you have chosen if the economic factor had not existed? If it hadn't been a problem of earning a living, what would you have preferred to do? If you're one of those people who perhaps would have preferred to do nothing, then you better take on the responsibilities of the moment. But if you already had dreams, and they were blighted, and there were instincts to creativity, I know people in late life who are writing very beautiful poetry. Poetry seems to be one opening that comes through. Sometimes an individual has had a poetic instinct all their lives and never actually wrote 4 verses until they were over 60. But it's there. Others find, as the responsibilities of raising children and things of this nature, that the old dreams come back, that there was something they always wanted to do. Some of them wanted to travel, some of them wanted to teach, some wanted to go into religious life, others wanted to complete imperfect or interrupted careers. but everyone wanted to do something. And when they do that something, nearly always there's little or no satisfaction unless that something they want to do is a common service. It is something they want to share. The poet wants to share his innermost feelings with anyone who will read his poetry. The actor wants to share his reactions to the drama that he participates in. Everyone would like to have a field of expression, an expression that is worthwhile. Now, this expression may be censored by a lifetime of frustrations, and it may be that by the time we get around to it, some of the edge and ambitions of our inner lives have become quieted. But everyone can do something. Everyone can make some kind of a creative contribution. Perhaps no one will ever know about it but you. But if you do it, not merely talk about it, but do it, you will find that there is a great release within yourself. An individual who can develop a good creative outlet will probably never need psychological or psychiatric care. They will release from themselves, and everything that we release from these little plants, which we call our personalities, will either be flowers or fruit. The flowers represent the simple expression of the beauty in ourselves, and the fruit represents the contribution we make to the common survival. These things can help us, but we must come to the conclusion that deity in its infinite wisdom was not interested in creating a lazy creation. It didn't want to make a world of people trying to escape responsibility and hoping to cut down working hours till they do not do anything at all. This is not the divine plan. And if we frustrate this divine plan enough, the punishments will get heavier and heavier. But we are going to change, and we're going to learn before we get through. So the easiest and the most purposeful thing is to learn now, to get started at it, to do the things that we have within ourselves. Go into your own depth and find out what's there that you could use to make a more beautiful life. That you could also find ways of sharing life, getting over prejudices. One problem, of course, is that the prejudiced person nearly always carries many years of irritation or disillusionment or anxiety over things that may have happened so long ago that everyone else has forgotten them. But prejudice is not beautiful. Prejudice doesn't help. It only locks the individual in negatives, and it closes to the mind that is prejudiced all the beauties of the area in which that prejudice controls. If we are prejudiced against people, if we're prejudiced against arts or crafts or religions or races or anything of this nature, we are simply cutting off part of that one glory of life which we should understand, should accept, and should be able to use in the development and maturing of our own consciousness. Clearing up prejudice, opinions, getting over old grudges, do anything possible to take false pressures off of your own subjective life. For it is only when the false pressures go or cease that the true pressure of the divine life within can come through. It is only possible to move from the inside out when we stop cramming everything from the outside in. As long as we build our entire life upon outside circumstances, the inner life has no chance. It goes along until we depart from here, and in due time it comes back with another body. But unless we allow it to speak, we will never know what our real destiny is, and we will be pushed about by the common attitudes of unenlightened persons. But even these unenlightened persons are growing also. Everything is growing. It is a magnificent unfoldment, but it exists on many levels. and each individual must try to function on the highest level available to his own consciousness. And at the same time that he is doing this, realize that the higher his level of consciousness is, the more perfectly he will understand all whose consciousness is less than his own. That which is above always understands all of that which is below, because it cannot get to the above without passing through the below. And in the basic subjective of the entity, all conditions of achievement less than our present level exist. And by calling upon our inner life, we develop a great sympathy for the lesser. And instead of looking down on it, we regard it as a parent might regard children. As Pythagoras very wisely observed, there are only three relationships in life. He says, there are those who are wiser than we are, and they are our parents, regardless of whether they have any blood relationship or not. Then there are those whose knowledge and wisdom is equal to our own. They are our brothers and sisters, and we exist with them in perfect equity. And there are then those also whose knowledge is less than our own. They are our children, regardless of whether they're related to us or not. They are our children, and we shall instruct them. So there are no other relations in life. And the individual who has the proper outlook or in-look upon life will realize that it is one very beautiful picture, a wonderful, sensitive, sympathetic situation in which we are all bound together by the strongest possible ties and separated by the weakest possible separative factors. As we gain more understanding and sympathy for this, I think we will find more of our place in the plan and how to cooperate with the divine purpose.